Hey guys, Tim Ulbrich here. One of the biggest monthly expenses for pharmacists is housing. And for many, that will come in the form of a mortgage payment. As a homeowner myself, I realized that between the mortgage itself, property taxes, insurance, and HOA fees, the overall payment can really add up. And while you can't change most of these charges, there is one thing that you may be able to, and that is the interest rate. The most obvious reason to refinance your mortgage is to get a lower rate. And depending on the term, a lower rate could reduce your monthly payment and result in less interest paid over the course of the loan. Now, there are multiple lenders that offer mortgage refinancing. And unfortunately, the process for comparing rates traditionally has not been an easy one. You can go to local banks or obtain rates from individual lenders online, but this requires you to submit documents multiple times and can take significant time and effort. Fortunately, there's a faster and easier way to compare rates, and that's why we have partnered with Credible. Not only does Credible have an outstanding user-friendly platform that lets you compare multiple lenders within a few minutes, but you also deal directly with them until the final stages of the process. You can compare refinance rates and learn more about the process by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/mortgage. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/mortgage.
You need to do your thorough research on the cheapest way to get to and from an interview or mid-year. So you need to look at prices of driving, flying, and public transportation.
You're listening to the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, a show all about inspiring you, the pharmacy professional, on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Hi, I'm Tim Ulbrich, and on this week's episode, I talk with Sarah Cummins, a PGY2 emergency medicine pharmacy resident at the University of California, Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, California. We talk about specific tips and strategies for how to make the residency application process more affordable, as well as some general advice to students that are starting this often expensive process. Sarah, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
So our conversation began over the summer on LinkedIn, and I knew what you shared would fit so well in the fall as P4s are gearing up for the residency application process, and really also for preceptors that are listening, faculty members that are listening, that they can also share some of this information with students that they may be mentoring, coaching, helping along the way. And before we dig into your tips and tricks for making the residency application process affordable, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself. So tell us about your pharmacy career, what led you ultimately into pharmacy, and then how you're able to determine the path that you wanted to take in terms of residency training.
Sure. So I started out at Purdue University in Indiana, which is where I'm from.
Boilermakers.
Yes. So I grew up in Indiana, went to school there. Then I did my PGY1 residency in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Then I drove 3,000 miles across the country to go to UC Davis in Sacramento for my PGY2 in emergency medicine. I think I originally got into pharmacy because the same reason that many of us do, because we're nerds and we like science and we like helping people. And I really liked the aspect of this career where I felt like I could make a difference in patients' lives face to face, talking to them and helping them manage their diseases versus, some of the other healthcare professionals you don't get as much face time as you do with pharmacy. And I really like that.
And when did you know emergency medicine was the path that you wanted to take?
That one was a little bit of a quick decision. So I had originally thought I was an infectious diseases person all the way. I love ID. I did my bachelor's in microbiology and biochem. I had done ID research. I love bacteria. I think they're so cool. But then I did an appy in the emergency room, and I was a little shocked at how much I really enjoyed it. So then I started second guessing myself, wondering if maybe I was an EM person instead of an ID person. I did an EM rotation during my PGY1, and that kind of sold it for me that I was actually an EM person instead of an ID person. I think I made the right decision. I feel very at home. I feel like this is my niche, and I'm really excited to go to work every day. And I think that that's all we can really hope for with careers, is just being really happy with what we do.
Absolutely. And the irony, we'll talk obviously about mindset around spending and frugality, and the irony that you ended up in California where cost of living is high, but thankfully you had, some behaviors and strategies in place that could help you, manage some of that. And really, what I want to spend our time on today is that you You had tweeted an amazing list of topics about how to make the residency application more affordable, where folks should consider spending money, where it's worth it, cutting where it's not, and some general advice to those that are starting this process. And I should mention, disclaimer here, we are obviously fall 2020. Given the situation with COVID-19, this residency recruitment application interview cycle is going to look different than any other one that we've had before. And so some of that we don't yet know at this point. Some of it we do in terms of, things like ASHP mid-year, of course, being virtual. Will all interviews be remote? Will some be on site? I think it's probably leaning towards remote, but certainly that's a ways off as we think about the February and March timeframe. So for those that are listening, P4 is applying this year during the spring 2021, going into the match to start July 2021. Obviously, we're in a unique situation, but we expect others in the future. We may be back in more of that traditional environment. So before we get into these strategies that you mentioned, one of the things I was asking you before we hit record, and really one of the things that impressed me when I first ran across, what you shared on this topic, is I could tell you had really an intentional mindset around your finances, but specifically you had a mindset around being frugal. And I think here it's important that we're talking about, places where it's important that we think about cutting, but also places where we think it might be important to spend some, and that's okay, where it's worth it. So my question is, where does that frugal mindset come for you? Where did that start?
That is such a great question. And I don't actually have an answer for you. I don't really know. There isn't one pivotal moment in my life where I learned this. No one really taught it to me. I think it came from pressure of not having financial resources as a student and not having support with family, friends, and whatnot financially going through this process. I've always been the kind of person that I don't do anything halfway. If I'm going to do it, I'm really going to do it. And I put a lot of work into figuring out exactly how I could afford this because my resources were very limited. I made a goal to go to mid-year. I made a goal to apply to the programs I wanted to all over the country. And I planned accordingly to make sure I could do that. And I think the skill that I learned from that was very difficult for me to understand at first. And I think very difficult for a lot of people who are financially limited is to plan ahead. So many times, when we don't have resources, we don't have a lot of money, we just think about the here and now. How am I going to afford my bills this week, this month? Where can I cut costs on my groceries this week? But I'm not thinking about what I'm going to be paying for 8 months in advance. And that's something that's kind of a difficult mindset for people to adopt when they've never really had to do it, or where they're always in this fight or flight mode on how they're going to survive each week. So that was something I really had to push myself to do.
Yeah, that's great input. As we talk often on the show about the intentionality of a financial plan, thinking ahead, planning ahead, thinking long term, which is hard, especially when you think about in the position of a student, where you obviously have a limited income and certainly maybe in a debt accrual phase with student loans. And so as you put together the time and the effort to share this list out, what were some of the motivations of doing that? Obviously, it was near and dear to you and your own plan, but did you also see others that were struggling with it?
Absolutely. So I saw a lot of students posting on Twitter, residents posting on Twitter, just kind of venting how frustrating it is that this process is so expensive, sharing how difficult it is to afford this, sharing their fears. And I really just wanted to provide a little bit of hope and a little bit of encouragement to those students who are in the same situation that I was in, where you have to really work a real part-time job to fund your expenses. And I think that the post definitely achieved that. A lot of people messaged me sharing their thanks for just reaching out and saying, hey, it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible.
And I'm so glad you did, Sarah, because as you know, as I know living through it, as our listeners know living through it, P4 year, that final year is often when things fall off the tracks financially, right? So you've got, obviously you're in a transitionary year. So depending on where you're doing your rotations, you may be going out of the area. You have additional transportation expenses, additional housing expenses. You may need additional professional clothes, other things, expenses add up. Obviously, busy hours, you tend to maybe have to eat meals on the go. So you have lots of expenses that come with rotations. But then you also have many schools, the tuition and fees are higher in the fourth year when you're doing experiential rotations. And then on top of this, you have, whether it's residency, job, combination of both, you've got the additional expenses that are associated here. So I think sometimes I see, and I don't know if you saw this with your classmates, where, I see this among students where they're like, my gosh, I'm already hit $160,000 in debt. Like, what's it matter at this point, right?
Yeah, just add it to the tab.
Yeah. And I think, again, what we're talking about here is whether it's $100, $1,000, or $10,000, the intentionality and the mindset, and having really the processes, whether it's a budget, this long-term thinking, to really be able to see the benefits of this in other parts of your financial plan in the future are really important. Do you, just as a general ballpark, what do you think on average students are spending when you think about the residency application process? I mean, you got the applications, you've got mid-year, you've got travel, you've got professional clothes. Like, what do you anticipate that number is?
Thousands. I know it's thousands. It's definitely different for each person. So going to mid-year in and of itself is very expensive. So if for whatever reason you don't go to mid-year, you can cut a large portion of that out. But even the application process is expensive. So the NMS match fee is $160. The forecast fee is $110. That gets you 4 applications included. So if you want to apply to more than 4 programs, you're going to be paying $43 a piece for every additional program. So just to submit your applications, if you want to apply to 10 programs, which is what I feel like a lot of students do on average, is $528 just to try.
Yeah, and as we know, if that is borrowed money, it's going to cost more at some point, right? As interest accrues and things into the future. So we're going to go through, as I mentioned, you put together this list and you broke up these tips into 6 main categories. Number 1, how to save money before interviews. Number 2, things to think about at mid-year. 3, on the traveling side. 4, eating while you're traveling. 5, where you should spend your money. So essentially permission granted where it's worth it. And then 6, some general advice. So let's start with this first category, prior to interviews. And you start off by sharing some advice for people before they even send applications in or have interviews lined up. So what's some of your advice here, and why is this important?
So I think that this is actually probably the most important part and where you could potentially have the most cost savings, because I think the first thing you need to do is figure out what your goals are. You need to figure out if you are going to be applying to programs near home, if you're going to be looking all over the country. And then you need to make a plan on how to budget for that, how much money you can expect to have to pay, and then execute that plan. So I think for a student that is, I'm going to just pick the most expensive example. So let's say you really want to do it. You're going to apply all over the country. You're going to go to mid-year. You're going to go all out. Start saving early, like P3 year early. One thing I did, if you have anybody in your life that likes to buy you birthday gifts or holiday gifts, ask for gift cards. So I asked for gift cards to Macy's department store because I know that they have a pretty good selection of suits and business clothes, and they also have pretty good sales sometimes. So I asked for gift cards early on during P3 year, so that way I could start to collect a wardrobe, some nice shoes, and some other things to wear to mid-year, because if you wait to the last minute to do that, that's just going to be another expense added on top of it if you don't plan on anything to wear to these interviews and PPSs. Another thing is just registering for mid-year is expensive. So as a student, this year it is actually free because of COVID, which is incredible. Snaps to ASHP for that. But last year and every other year, it's not free. So the registration fee is different depending on whether you're an ASHP member or not. If you're a student member, it's $340, but if you're a non-member, it's $480. And this is a really easy place to save money, because if you just register for a membership, it's $54. So you can save like almost $80 if you just do the membership and then apply as a student member instead of not being a member and applying as a non-member. So do your research on that. Make sure that you aren't paying more money for registration than you need to. The other thing with planning to go to mid-year is once you have everything like you need to wear and you have your plan on what kind of programs you want to start looking at, and you are starting to think about flights and hotels and stuff, then that becomes a lot more work. And I think that is the most time-intensive part of this.
Great advice, Sarah. And one of the things I want to add here is you think about number of applications and my experience working with students going through this process. I've worked with some students that have applied to 1 or 2 sites and to 22 sites and everything in between, and you mentioned 10 is a pretty good number that you see out there, I would agree with that. I mean, I think most students are probably applying to somewhere between 8 to 12 sites.
Mhm.
But what I really am encouraging the listeners to think about is you have to do some really serious self-reflection to really identify what factors might determine how many sites you need to apply at. So you're looking at obviously things like, the reputation of those programs, how many applications might they be getting, how selective are they, geographic types of things, the cost that's going to be associated with the travel, how strong of a candidate are you, how well networked are you with that, have you worked there, have you had a rotation there, and all of those things should have a significant impact on how many sites you're applying to. And I think there can be a challenge, especially for the all-stars out there that are listening, those that have really strong connections, have done all of their things along the way well to make themselves a strong candidate. There can be a feeling in the moment of, oh my gosh, match is so competitive. They look at the national match statistics and then they apply to a bunch of places. For some, that's necessary, and for others, there's not. So I think really doing some reflection to determine what that right number is, or working with, some advisors at the college or others that can help you do that is really important.
Definitely.
Let's talk about mid-year for a moment. You mentioned the registration fee, which of course, obviously this year in 2020, we have, again, somewhat of a unique situation, but we know that's just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to costs associated with mid-year. So talk to us about other strategies here that people can be thinking about for how to save money as it comes to mid-year. And here, obviously, we're talking about more in the traditional sense of in-person mid-year.
Yes. So mid-year historically takes place in one of 4 cities: New Orleans, Orlando, Las Vegas, or Anaheim. So those are the only cities that have enough conference space to hold the vast amount of pharmacists and students that are drawn to these conventions. So this has been done before. People have gone to all of these cities before, found the cheapest place to live. There's probably a lot of people who have advice out there. So any students that are wondering where the cheapest spots are, where you can get a good deal at, feel free to just tweet it out and ask, hey, who went to mid-year in Anaheim? Who went to mid-year in Orlando? What did you do? And those people might have a little bit of advice to contribute. But something that all of these destinations have in common is they are expensive to go to. So one thing it's really hard to budget for is all the food and unexpected costs that you're going to accrue there. So you think about, okay, I'm going to pay for my hotel, I'm going to pay for my flight, I get there, then what? Sometimes that airport is a substantial distance away from where your hotel is. And those Ubers, Lyfts can be $50, $60 one way, especially in some of the bigger cities. And this counts for interviews too. So one thing that I do is I do my research on the public transportation system. So some of these cities don't have a lot of great options for public transportations, but most of them have buses, and buses are cheap. They do take a long time, however. So if you can plan to have an earlier flight where you have a little bit more time to get to your hotel, look into getting a bus ticket for $2.50 compared to spending whatever the surprise cost of the Uber or Lyft is going to be, because that is not a discrete cost. It's going to be a random number depending on how busy they are.
Yeah.
Another thing that I spent more money on than I thought I was going to spend, even though I planned for it, was food. So you wake up in the morning and you're in your hotel room, you're starving, you just traveled all day. So what are you going to do? You're going to go down to the Starbucks, get a coffee, maybe a granola bar or a muffin or something, and then it's $12 because that's what it is in Las Vegas. I paid for a banana that was $9.
And you have no choice.
Yeah, and that's it, because you're starving, you're exhausted, and that's what you need. So something that you can do to mitigate these costs is to plan for being hungry. I called ahead to hotels to see if they offer in-room coffee, because some of them have that cheap coffee that you can make just in your room. That's great. That's right. Because it's $0. It's a little bit of an appetite suppressant, so it can tide me over until I can eat breakfast somewhere. Also, if you're going to be going to mid-year for a couple days, you're probably going to check a bag, which costs about $30, but it'll save you money in the long run versus just trying to shove everything on a carry-on bag, because you can fill that bag with snacks and food.
Mm-hmm.
I put a couple boxes of granola bars. I had some Easy Mac cups because I called and asked if my hotel room had a microwave. And that
Mm-hmm.
those just having that little bit of food available was really a lifesaver because it saved me a lot of money and it saved me a lot of time from having to go to a restaurant or wait in the ungodly lines at the cafes.
Yes.
And you don't think about that cost when you're planning your trips. You just think about the
Mm-hmm.
major expenses, but that really adds up. I think I would say I probably saved maybe $200 just by
Mm-hmm.
planning for the coffee and the food alone.
As you're talking, Sarah, I'm smiling as you're talking because I'm thinking of all of the mid-year meetings that I've been at as a student, as a new practitioner on the other side interviewing, where some things it's like it takes so long to learn some of those lessons, but where it's you're standing in those long lines and you're not only waiting, but then you're spending $20 for coffee and a muffin. You're frustrated, and then you're still hungry, and you're off sync with how you normally eat and all these things. So I think preparation here and planning is so important.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm using this word right. The opportunity cost. It's like when you're very, very hungry is different when you're not very hungry. So you're more likely to spend more money on food if you're starving versus if you're not starving because you have more time to plan for it. Another tip that I have if you're going to go to mid-year is this thing called the Industry Showcase. So at first glance, you might not think that that's for you as a student because it's basically a bunch of pharma companies and tech companies that set up booths to showcase their products. But this is an absolute gold mine for hungry students. Last year, I got free espressos, like individually wrapped sugar cookies, snacks. They gave out water bottles. So basically, you just go up, you can get all of their free snacks and food and stuff, and just take a pamphlet, pretend to be interested, and then just go on your merry way. It's incredible. So most students don't venture in there because they don't see a need to. They're not, a hospital looking for new technology, but are you thirsty? Do you want a free water bottle? Go for it. It's great. You won't regret it.
That's great. I mean, the specific advice you have here is fantastic. And I know for the preceptors that are listening, they're probably smiling as well, but I hope the students are taking notes. And these things add up. It's a combination of planning ahead. It's a combination of getting creative, cutting expenses while you're there, and hopefully together, some of these will have a real impact. And we're really just getting warmed up, right? So we talked about the cost of applications. We talked about the cost of mid-year, which even in this year, is of course going to be significantly different. But we haven't yet talked about traveling. So when it comes to traveling for interviews, I know for many folks, this can look very different if they're maybe just applying in one region where they live in their colleges versus those that are looking across the country. So what pieces of advice here do you have in terms of traveling for interviews?
I have a lot. And I think this is the piece of this whole thread and podcast that is potentially the most cost saving. So it takes a lot of time to do this, but it's really worth it in the end. You need to do your thorough research on the cheapest way to get to and from an interview or mid-year. So you need to look at prices of driving, flying, and public transportation. So driving, estimate your gas costs and don't just guess. You can go online and Google gas price calculator and figure out if for the exact make and model of your car, how much money you can expect to pay for what the current gas prices are, because those fluctuate each year. Sometimes it's very expensive, sometimes it's not. Additionally, if you're going to be traveling for several hours to wherever your interview site is, a lot of people use toll roads. They're much faster, it saves time, but it costs money. There's this website called tollsmart.com, and you can use it to calculate toll fees anywhere in the country. You just type in your start address and then your destination address, and it'll show you the route that you would take using toll roads to see how much money that costs, because who knows how much toll roads cost off the top of their head. I've never met anybody. I have no idea. It's just it's a guess. It's a surprise. Sometimes you need cash. Sometimes you can use card. No one ever knows. It's just a big mystery. So if you plan ahead for that, for the gas, another thing you need to plan for if you're going to drive is parking, because a lot of times hotel parking is not free. $40 a night, $60 a night, depending on where you go. In some of the bigger cities, and even in some of the smaller cities, you can use this app or website. It's called Spot Hero. So you can just go to spothero.com, and basically what it does is it shows all the available parking spots in garages, in lots, and you can compare prices of how much money you're going to pay to leave your car in that lot or that parking garage from the time that you arrive to the time that you leave. And it can be substantially cheaper than parking at your hotel. Another thing to do if you're planning on driving is try to pick an interview day on a Monday or a Friday. So that way Sunday you have plenty of time to drive and you're not going to be rushed, especially if you're going to be driving like 10 or 12 hours or something crazy like that. And then Fridays you'll have plenty of time to drive that evening or even the next day if you need to. So that's always nice. For flying, the best case scenario is always to find a flight that arrives the day before the interview and then have a return flight right after the interview is finished the next day in the evening. But that's usually not the cheapest flight. So again, you got to do your research. It might actually be cheaper to stay an extra day and pay another, $80 for your hotel or Airbnb and then take the early morning flight the next day. I did this and it saved me over $200 for one interview. And then the last mode of transportation is public transportation. Some places they have trains that go, in between big cities. If you're someone that's coming from a big city, I was not. But Megabus is a lifesaver. Megabus, I love Megabus. Shout out to Megabus. You're awesome. You can buy a bus ticket on one of this double-decker bus, and they are cheap. You can ride on a bus for 9 hours for as low as $3.50 after taxes and fees. And I did this for one interview. I rode the bus for 9 hours one day and then went to my interview and then flew home the next day with a one-way ticket. And that saved me over $150 compared to doing a round trip and flying on Sundays, because flying on Sundays is so expensive.
Yes. There
are also seats. There are 8 seats on each of these buses that have a table in front of them. So you can have like a little cup holder and a table. You can get your laptop out and do some schoolwork or whatever you want to work on, prepare for the interview while you're actually on the bus, which is what I did. So it was a great use of my time. And then, so then you can just do a hybrid of these options. So you can look into the price of a one-way car rental to drive on Sunday, show up for your interview Monday, fly home with a one-way ticket. It's a lot of work putting all these side by side for every single interview, but trust me, it's so worth it.
And one of the things, Sarah, I remember you wrote about, which really resonated, and I want to make sure the students hear is, not being afraid to ask the sites, and whether that's the RPD or somebody that they have delegated that responsibility of coordinating interviews. I think generally speaking, the sites want to be amenable and want to work with folks if it's going to help save them, money, time, coordination. So whether that's stacking interviews, if you're going to be in a certain area, so you don't have to travel twice. Or I remember you had written about, just a schedule, and by asking a question, they were able to move something around by a half hour so you could take a flight out that day that was cheaper. So, I think being open, and obviously there's a respectful, professional way to do that, but not necessarily feeling afraid to have some of those conversations that could have cost savings depending on the mode of travel and where that interview is taking place.
Definitely. So I feel a lot of students don't want to be the person that looks like they can't figure it all out themselves and aren't completely independent and savvy, and they don't need any help from the RPDs. But, they want you to be there. They want you to be able to be comfortable and to have plenty of time. I remember I emailed an RPD and I asked, I know my interview ends at 4. There's a 5 o'clock flight at the airport. Do you think I would have enough time to make it from the hospital to the airport and make that flight? Because it's $200 cheaper than all the other flights. And I would like to save that money if possible. Every person can understand this. Absolutely. So she was great. And she said, traffic is minimal, security is minimal, and I can bump your interview day up a half an hour just to give you a little bit of extra time. And it was awesome. So they're experts. They live in that city. They know their way around. They know, don't take this rail from the airport to the hospital because it's generally not very safe, or don't stay in this area, or fly into this other airport instead of the main airport because it's a lot cheaper or faster. They have all these tips. They live there. They travel there. And I don't know if I've met one RPD that would not gladly share that.
I agree. And as someone who has served on both sides of this in terms of an applicant as well as an RPD, I think often, if schedules are sent, people are busy, they're trying to coordinate a lot of things, and sometimes just somebody asking that and they're willing to work with it. So don't be afraid to ask that question. Next category, we talked a little bit about this with mid-year and packing food, but eating while traveling. And I think this is obviously a piece that is often missed when thinking about saving money in the residency process. but just like if you're at home, eating out can be really expensive. So give us some general tips or thoughts that you have on how folks can save on eating and food expenses while they're traveling.
Definitely. So one thing I noticed that I didn't really prepare for, I guess, when I was interviewing is that sometimes I would be interviewing on one side of the country one day, and then a few days later be on the other side of the country the next day. And those time changes are different. So I got hungry at very odd hours. Like I would wake up in California at 4 a.m. ready for breakfast, but there's no places that are breakfast because I'm used to that being 7 a.m. on the East Coast. So I always packed some granola bars, some packaged foods. I'm not going to recommend you check a bag for interviews just because that's a wasted expense. So you can't like make food like a sandwich or something and bring that on the plane. It has to be prepackaged. So I'm a big fan of those little packs of goldfish crackers. Again, mac and cheese, noodle cups, those kind of things are always not a bad idea to have on board. But just making sure that you're not in a situation where you're unprepared and you're going to be tempted to buy food in the airport or buy hotel food or have to run out before your interview because you're hungry and you really wish you had coffee and you didn't think about that. And then it's stressful, it's expensive, and then you get home and you're like, wow, how did I spend so much money? I didn't even notice that happened. Just being prepared for that is I think the best way to prevent it.
I agree. And as someone who likes to eat every hour or so when I travel, I swear airports and hotels are like the death of me when it comes to food, options, costs. I generally eat more at home and am somewhat of a picky eater. So it's not only expensive, but it's like, you can't even always get what you want. So
I know. And don't even think about that mini fridge either.
No, absolutely not. Don't even open it. Yeah. So we talked about where we can cut back. And I want to end by talking about where you should spend money. So obviously there's going to be some costs that, applicants have to incur in some areas where maybe they shouldn't try to cut corners. So talk to us about those areas where you have felt like, this is an area where you don't necessarily want to invest a bunch of time and, resources to try to cut back, but rather give permission to spend.
Definitely. So I think the one area that I felt personally I was going to spend the money was on my interview suit. So I feel most confident when I'm wearing clothes that fit me very well, that I think look nice. And when I'm going to an interview, I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to be worried that my outfit looks weird or just something doesn't look very put together. So I saved up and I got a very nice suit. And so I wouldn't say, I guess my definition of very nice might be a little bit different than everybody else's definition of very nice. But I got a matching suit and had it tailored to fit me. And what I did basically is just rewore that one suit instead of getting, a bunch of less nice outfit, less expensive outfits. One thing that's a lifesaver, if you're going to be re-wearing suits instead of getting it dry cleaned in between each interview, that can be really expensive. Hotel steamers. So if you call ahead to the hotel and ask them to put a steamer in your room, pretty much every hotel I've ever called have steamers available. You just have to ask for them.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So also starch spray is your friend. So if you just want to iron it out and put a little starch spray on it, fold it very gently inside your carry-on and take it out first thing and then steam it. It'll look brand new and you won't have to get it dry cleaned over and over again because it's free to use a steamer versus getting it dry cleaned. So I think spending money on my outfit helped me feel more confident and I think probably in the long run helped me be more relaxed during the interviews. Additionally, I think another place to feel okay to spend a little bit more money is if there aren't many hotel options or perhaps the hospital that you're interviewing at isn't in the best part of town, is to make sure that you feel comfortable and safe where you're staying. One of my interviews, I remember specifically the hotels were like over $200 a night, some $300 a night, really close to the hotel. And I opted to get a cheap Airbnb instead, and that was a huge mistake. It was not a safe part of town. I felt very uncomfortable, and the Airbnb did not have any of the amenities that I needed. I usually don't pack hair dryers because most places have them. But I did not realize or did not look for the hair dryer until after I had showered in the morning before my interview. But there was a space heater, so I just was pressing my wet hair up against the space heater to try to dry it. Oh, it looked horrible. But spend the money on somewhere that you're going to feel safe, somewhere that you're going to feel comfortable, because you don't want to be stressing right before the interview. You don't want to be worried about it or not get a good night's sleep, because that's definitely going to show in your interview performance the next day.
And Sarah, these are fantastic tips. They're specific, they're actionable. They're ones that I'm thinking of, man, I wish I would have known some of this, but I'm glad we can share this with, students that are out there. Again, preceptors that are helping coach or mentor students. Hopefully they'll be able to find this information valuable. And I want to close by coming full circle to where we started. And I mentioned, I think the mindset piece is something that I hear as you're talking. I know I read it when I first came across your content. I know you said, I'm not really sure exactly where, I can pinpoint that, but I can tell you through our conversation, it is clear to me that you have an intentionality around your spending, around your money. We talk all the time about the podcast, about the importance of that intentionality of finding your why, of really aligning your spending and spending money where it's important and not spending money where it's not important. And I can tell that you have that. And I am so excited to see where not only your professional journey goes, but your financial journey and the impact that you're going to have on the trainees that will work with you, whether that's students on experiential training, residents, peers, and the others that you'll be able to influence. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show to share this information and the tips of the advice that we'll be able to share with the group applying this year as well in the future. And my last question for you is, where can our listeners go to connect with you further and perhaps follow your journey along the way?
Thank you for all of those kind words. I really, really appreciate it. As far as where students can contact me, I do have a Twitter that I'm fairly active on. I've had quite a few students DM me with questions about mid-year or my experience or just how to afford this crazy process in general. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions from anybody. You can find my Twitter at SC_FarmD. And that's probably the easiest way to reach me.
Awesome. We will link to that in the show notes as well as some of the other sites that you mentioned throughout the episode. Again, appreciate your time coming on the show. I know this information is going to be valuable. And for our listeners, if you like what you heard on this week's episode of the podcast, please leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show each and every week. And if you haven't yet done so, I hope you will join us in the Your Financial Pharmacist Facebook group. Over 6,000 pharmacy professionals across the country committed to helping each other on their path towards achieving financial freedom. Have a great rest of your week.